Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first public event of the year, so I hope I can remember how to do this. I'd like to welcome you all, whether you are here in the room or joining us remotely, on behalf of our director, Susan Webber. And my name is Ivan Gaskell. I'm Professor of Cultural History here at Bard Graduate Centre. We're assembled on the ancestral homeland of the Lenape peoples on the island of Mannahatta, a gathering place for native peoples for thousands of years. And I'd just like to remind everyone that regardless of title deeds, morally, this remains native land. It's scarcely an exaggeration to state that our speaker this evening, Peter Burke, is one of the most influential living historians. He's one of the originators of history from below, meaning those historians who from the 1960s onward attended to previously ignored or relatively disadvantaged populations. His 1978 book, Popular Culture in Early Modern Europe, revolutionized many people's views of what early modern European history could be, and I include myself among them as an early reader of that book when I was a graduate student. Peter is Professor Emeritus of Cultural History at the University of Cambridge, where he's also a Life Fellow of Emmanuel College. He came to Cambridge in 1979 from the University of Sussex, where he was one of a remarkable group of historians that included Asa Briggs and Ranajit Guhar. The kind of history that Peter long espoused has been the bane of more traditional historians who remain dedicated to the political deeds of elite males. Now, I remember many years ago when one such elite male historian was introducing Peter before a lecture that Peter was to give at Oxford University, where Peter had been an undergraduate. This older, crusty historian performed what was clearly to him a somewhat distasteful task, and he did so patronizingly and disdainfully. It was a perfect demonstration of the rift within the historical establishment. I also remember Peter's later response to such treatment. He told me, years later, that when he was appointed to the newly created chair at Cambridge, he was asked what he would like to be a professor of. He chose Professor of Cultural History, knowing that this would vex the old guard of political historians. And many years later, when I was asked the same question here, I chose the same title as a quiet homage to my old friend and colleague. Peter Burke has pioneered pressing material culture into historical service in books such as The Fabrication of Louis XIV from 1992 and Eyewitnessing in 2000. But he's also an intellectual historian in the broadest sense, publishing such works as A Social History of Knowledge. He's published more than 30 books, and his work has been translated into more than 30 languages. And his most recent publication, Ignorance, A Global History. I'm going to tell just one brief anecdote arising from my more than 4 decades of friendship with Peter Burke. When I was on the Faculty of Architecture and History of Art at Cambridge, Peter, in the history faculty, and I ran a seminar together. One day early in 1993, he phoned me and said that John Eliot, the great historian of the Spanish world, was to give the Trevelyan lectures on Richelieu and Olivares, and that we simply must go to the first one that very afternoon. Now, I was somewhat surprised, but I went with Peter, and I'm very glad that I did. The fact that Peter, champion of social and cultural history from below, had pointed out the importance of a lecture series on elite political figures was, I think, of great significance. It showed that these two fields of inquiry, so often embroiled in mutual antagonism, were actually complementary. It marked a turning point in my conception of what history might be. Now, Peter does that. He changes our conception of what history might be. And this evening, he's turning to a new area of focused interest, sharing new thoughts on a topic that should be of great concern in this institution: the invention of connoisseurship. Please welcome Peter Burke.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back in Bard. I have very good memories of last time. And thank you enormously, Ivan, for the generous introduction. I'm afraid I won't be really able to live up to it. Now, in 1954, a great Italian connoisseur, Roberto Longhi, not the person there, I'll come to him in due course. The great connoisseur Roberto Longhi argued the need for a history of connoisseurs. 4 decades later, when it hadn't happened, the art historian Enrico Castelnuovo referred to the need for a social history of connoisseurs. But curiously enough, no one, as far as I know, has responded to these pleas for a general history of this topic. There are, of course, many excellent monographs on aspects of the topic, individual connoisseurs and so on. But there are also many gaps between these monographs. There's no big picture. And so in a book that I'm currently writing, I attempt to fill this apparently empty space. Though I should say that my overview is more or less limited to the West, despite the long history of connoisseurship in China and Japan, and that it focuses, as indeed most Western connoisseurs have done, on the old masters. Now, why should it be me doing this? I'm not an artist, not an art dealer, not an art curator, or even an art historian. I think there is a case for plain historians, if you like, general historians, having a contribution to make in this area, especially to the wider context of connoisseurship. One obvious thing which the art historians are well aware of is the way in which connoisseurship has been linked over the centuries to the inevitable expansion of the art market. But again, I think there is something to say about individualism. I think remembering Jakob Burckhardt's famous chapter on the development of the individual in the Renaissance, doesn't this underlie the new interest in the biographies of artists that we see occasionally in the 15th century, much more often in the 16th, and still more often thereafter? And then thinking of a second wave of individualism, that is, in the age of Burckhardt himself, who wrote in a letter how he would like to be considered a good private individual rather than somebody with public achievements. Well, I think that second wave of individualism underlies the interest in reconstructing the development of artistic personalities in the way that, for example, Berenson did. Now, for the last 3 decades or so, I've been trying to write about aspects of a huge subject, the history of knowledge, or histories of knowledges. And it is from this perspective that I approach connoisseurship in the book and also tonight. In other words, I want to focus now on a practice rather than on individual connoisseurs. Of course, individuals will make their appearance, beginning with Giovanni Morelli, one of the major figures in this practice in the 19th century, famous or notorious both for his idea that connoisseurship was a science like the medicine and anatomy in which he'd previously been trained, and famous or notorious again for his idea that if you focus on apparently trivial details, like the way in which ears are represented, this is an invaluable shortcut to attributing paintings to particular artists. And other famous figures from the age of Morelli, his rival Giovanni Cavalcaselle, the German Wilhelm Bode, the Dutchman Abraham Radius, the American Bernard Berenson, whom you see elegantly dressed and posed and obviously extremely aware of his elegance at that moment. And then two more Italians, Roberto Longhi, with whom I began, with his inescapable cigarette. All the photos of Longhi I've seen over from when he was in his 30s to when he was in his 70s. There's always a cigarette in his mouth. And finally in this list, Federico Zeri, an eccentric in many ways, but definitely somebody with a quite remarkable eye. So these are outstanding figures from the late 19th and from the 20th centuries. And I like to call them the stars, distinguishing them in the sharpness of their eye from ordinary experts, and distinguishing ordinary experts from a much larger group whom I call semi-connoisseurs, by which I mean amateurs who are extremely interested in attributing paintings as well as judging the quality, but they've not been trained. The basic point, there are degrees of connoisseurship rather than, as some people in the 18th century like to suggest, that there's a great gulf between the real connoisseur and the pseudo-connoisseur. Now, one attraction, maybe it's better to say challenge, of the study I'm trying to write, it's a cultural history of the eye. And it has to deal with the famous question of the claim to recognize, often in an instant, a flash, a kind of epiphany, to recognize not only aesthetic quality, but the hand of a given master. It's the essential operation of connaissance, based, of course, on what one might call close looking, on the analogy of the close reading pioneered in Cambridge, but based also on long experience and based also on an extraordinary visual memory. Because connoisseurship depends on the analysis of style. The analysis of style depends on comparison, and comparison means comparison with paintings which are far away from one another in space. But some of the people I mentioned, I think notably Berenson and Longhi and Zeri, had these incredible visual memories. So they would look at a painting and say, 10 years ago in a museum in another country, I saw something in this style. Indeed, occasionally they say, I think that this painting is not independent. It's a fragment of a larger piece, and you can find another part of this altarpiece in France or Switzerland or wherever. And when the comparison was made physically by bringing the items together, they turned out to be right. And yet another attraction, I think, of this extremely attractive topic is that it offers an example of the encounter between knowledges, or better maybe the collision between knowledges. On one side, the academic knowledge of art historians, but on the other, the various practical knowledges of artists themselves, of art dealers, of art restorers, and indeed art forgers. Each group is in a position to see something in paintings which is not so clear to the others. So it's important that some communication between these different forms of expertise takes place. So out of the collision, you have a kind of hybridization of different knowledges, or can I say a bundle of skills, or more grandly, if you prefer, the system of skills that is now known as connoisseurship, eventually emerging in Europe, especially in Italy, France, Germany, Britain, the Netherlands. Curiously, whereas the Germans and the Dutch have their own word for these skills, Kennerschaft or Kunstkennerschaft in German, the French and Italians, I don't know why, have been reduced to borrowing the English word connoisseurship, despite the fact it's a bit of a mouthful. I don't know how they pronounce it. I haven't been to a lecture where a Frenchman or an Italian uses the word. And to define it in the traditional manner, this connoisseurship is an art of judgment, and it has three main domains. So the capacity to discriminate between art of higher and lower quality. Secondly, to discriminate between the works of different artists. And finally, to discriminate between originals and copies, or indeed fakes. So the big question for a historian is clearly, when did this happen? I must admit I hesitated whether or not to include a question mark in my title after the word invention, because the debate on the so-called invention of art has been a warning. Some scholars argue or assume it took place in the 16th century, others affirm it took place in the 18th century, and so on. Trying to date practices raises acute problems. They change usually gradually rather than suddenly. And in any case, they must not be assumed to begin at the same time as the surviving records of them. So in that sense, everything I say has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because the period before about 1500, we really don't know much about these practical knowledges. They must have been there. We don't know how developed, refined they were, but we can follow the process from the early modern period onwards. The moment of textualization, which gives us our evidence, is likely to be much later than the practice itself. But the textualization is itself important because it assists the transition from implicit knowledge, which is what I assume was the case in the Middle Ages, to a knowledge because it is explicit, is open to being criticized, open to being verified. So now what I'd like to suggest in what follows is that important changes in judging works of art began in the 17th century, and they consist in what the British critic Raymond Williams, Welsh actually, what Williams described in a different context with a useful oxymoron, a long revolution. That really is my subject. Let me admit at the beginning that a case can be made for beginning the history of connoisseurship not in the 17th century, as I mean to argue, but in the 18th or the 19th centuries. The 18th century was the age of distinguished connoisseurs, Jonathan Richardson in Britain, Pierre-Jean Mariette in France, and so on. It was a time when the art of comparative stylistic analysis began to be assisted because one could use prints. So engravings and then mezzotints, aquatints, etchings, all forms of reproduction in this period, as well as forms of original art. And that's the moment that the terms connoisseur and more rarely connoisseurship appear in English. And I like to stress the words because new words are a kind of litmus paper for historians. They reveal new concerns, or at the very least, increasingly intense concerns, which then demand to be labelled. As for the 19th century, it's sometimes been argued that connoisseurship emerged in the age of Morelli, not only because of Morelli and his colleagues and rivals, but also because of the invention of photography, which made comparison more easy and more accurate than working from prints. And then the rise of public museums and galleries, and not least, the increasingly international art market, which meant there was a increasing demand for the skills of the connoisseur, as rising amounts of money were at stake in the attribution of paintings to great masters or minor masters. But still, in my view, the term invention, or maybe it's better to talk about the crystallization of connoisseurship, that the term is best used about the 17th century. That's the time when the terms conoscitore and connoisseur were spreading in Italy and France. A spread that at least suggests what we know from other sources to be the case. Amateurs were becoming increasingly interested in judging works of art. It was indeed for their guidance that we see the first treatises on the art of judging paintings, beginning very early in the 17th century in Rome with the treatise of a doctor, physician, Giulio Mancini, not published until the 20th century, but we know it was diffused by a number of manuscript copies, so it was something that attracted interest, at least in a restricted circle at the time. And then you have a sequence of publications, beginning, as far as I know, with the artist, engraver, Abraham Bosse in France. And then moving on to much better known figure, Roger de Pile, French diplomat, art critic, and even spy. It's interesting that his different skills and interests converged, because when France was at war with the Dutch Republic, Roger de Pile was sent to the Netherlands to spy, and his cover story was he was buying paintings. But then his cover was penetrated. He was jailed for 2 years till the war ended. But he was able, the conditions of some 17th century jails being relatively easy, he was able to write one of his treatises in the time that he spent there. And then, so that was a series of famous published treatises on biographies of artists and on the art of judging paintings. But for some reason, my favorite is an Italian working at the same time, Filippo Baldinucci, who also had a variety of careers because he was originally hired by Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici as an estate manager, but then it seems that the Cardinal discovered that his estate manager had the same love of art and the same skill in judging paintings that he had himself, and so he became a keeper of the Cardinal's drawings in particular. Now, all these writers, and some that I haven't mentioned, discuss the three basic skills, sense of quality, attributions to particular artists, and finally, the way to distinguish originals from copies. Now, I'm not a mind reader, but I think I have good reason to think that many of you will have been asking yourselves, what about the Renaissance? Surely there were connoisseurs in that period of great art and great interest in art. Now, I think in this case, it's absolutely vital to distinguish between two forms of collecting, paintings on the one hand and classical antiquities on the other. The demand for antiquities was high at this time, and the buyers included famous collectors such as Pope Paul II, Lorenzo de' Medici, and Isabella d'Este. There was a market for antiquities with all that implied. The humanist Poggio Bracciolini tried on one occasion to buy 3 marble heads from dealers in Greece, a head of Juno, a head of Minerva, head of Bacchus. The dealers attributed these heads to Praxiteles and Polykleitos, but Poggio was a skeptical sort of person, and so he wrote to a friend that he thought the Greek dealers, I quote, had made up the names simply in order to sell the heads more dearly. That's the first discussion of the problems of attribution that I've come across. So it's anybody who knows an earlier one, I would be most grateful if they spoke to me or wrote to me. And now in the 16th century, there's a considerable market in Rome for fake classical antiquities. And in the 1550s, a treatise on coins and medals by the Italian engraver Eneo Vico includes a chapter exactly on how you fake coins. You age them artificially by soaking them in urine, and then you bury them for a few months, and they come up looking not like new, but like old. I believe that he was writing to warn the collectors, but I think sometimes that would-be forgers might have tried to follow his recipes. But the important point, despite a small number of references to the beauty of statues and coins, or the skill and the ingenium that went into their making, antiquities were apparently viewed and almost always described primarily as relics of a much admired past. Holy relics, really. But painting was different because in the Renaissance, the dominant system of selling paintings was still the patronage of living artists. And contracts from the period make it very clear that what the patron is usually interested in was a particular subject and not a particular artist. This changes a bit around the year 1500, when, for example, that otherwise difficult customer Isabella d'Este, who likes having her orders obeyed to the letter, she was finally prepared to accept absolutely anything from Leonardo and Giovanni Bellini because she'd spent so many months trying to persuade them, and they were setting these conditions. So at this point, I want to suggest that the spread of amateur interest in the connoisseurship of paintings was a displacement of the humanist interest in antiquities. Another kind of hybridization I know this is a favorite word of mine, but I try not to use it too often, but a kind of hybridization took place, involving on one side more attention to the aesthetic side of antiquities, and on the other, a more scholarly approach to paintings. But the spread was slow. Early in the 16th century, a Venetian collector, Marcantonio Michiel, well-known figure in art history, wrote in his notebook, which was apparently a preparatory study for a book he hoped to write, but he never did. Anyway, he wrote that a fellow collector in Venice, I quote, possesses a copy of a work by Giorgione, which he believes to be the original. This is an early example of something that you find again and again in the history of art and connoisseurship, that the collector is absolutely sure that he or she has a work by one of the most famous artists. And then the expert comes along and coughs and says, actually, I think it's by someone a bit less famous. This happened on a famous occasion to Bernard Berenson, who was touring English country houses. And in one of them, the proud aristocrat shows him his Leonardo. And Berenson rather too quickly disabuses him and says he thinks it's by a minor artist. Lord Weems instantly showed him the door, so he has to leave the house without having seen the rest of the collection as a punishment for speaking out too quickly or too loudly. The trouble with the evidence from Michiel is that he doesn't let us know how he was the one that knew that the version was the copy while the owner thought it was the original. Would have been so fascinating. But it's as if he doesn't see attribution as a problem. He knows, the other person doesn't know. Easy as that. So now I come to the key witness for connoisseurship in the Renaissance. Obviously, this is going to be Giorgio Vasari. And Vasari obviously had an eye for quality. He clearly had a concern with differences in style because he describes them in his lives. He's interested in attributing paintings, especially made in his own time. But again, like Michiel, no awareness of the need to justify attributions, which sometimes have to have been the result of hearsay rather than his own observation, because he talks about paintings that were only to be seen in parts of Italy in which, since so much is known about it, his life, we can say fairly safely Vasari never set foot in those places. And one more remark about Vasari. There are two famous stories about attribution in the book. One is about Michelangelo's fake antique, that he made a statue of a sleeping Cupid and he sold it as an ancient Roman sculpture to Cardinal Riario, but afterwards admitted what he'd done. And secondly, that Andrea del Sarto copied a Raphael, or more exactly, a painting jointly produced by Raphael and one of his leading followers, Giulio Romano, and that when he looked at the painting, Giulio Romano thought he had recognized his own brushstrokes, but he couldn't because this was a copy. But what interests Vasari here is not the deception. What interests him is the skill of the people that could do these things. And so for these various reasons, I think the examples from the 16th century that I'm able to cite, not many, don't count for so much as the sheer weight of evidence in favor of major changes in these skills in the 17th century. So, first piece of evidence, I mentioned already the emergence of a new literary genre, the treatise on judging works of art. Second new literary genre, biographies of artists, because Vasari might have written the most famous collection of biographies of artists, but he's almost alone in the 16th century. His rival Condivi wrote a biography of Michelangelo, whom he thought he knew much better than Vasari. But that's hard to find other examples. But in the 17th century, you find biographies of French artists, Spanish, Dutch, German artists, artists from Venice, from Rome, from Bologna and Genoa, collections produced obviously to emulate Vasari's work, imitating him, but according to the authors of these biographies, also going beyond him, showing that other places could rival Vasari's beloved Florence. Of course, an ordinary plain historian is intrigued by dating. Why should the years around 1600 have been a turning point? One answer might be, I think I mentioned this already, that the treatises are a response to demand. There's an increasing number of amateur collectors of art, and I think that's important. But there's another shift which I find fascinating. The interest in old paintings was a new one. This is the time, from the very end of the 16th century, there are signs that works by Dürer, Raphael, Titian in particular, were collected more and more avidly by the Emperor Rudolf II, for example, who died in 1612, by his rival Maximilian of Bavaria. Not many people in the 16th century itself, but in the 17th, many. So the new demand for old art was supplied by a growing art market. And as in the case of antiquities, this market inevitably included fakes. Fake paintings by the masters are very rarely mentioned in the 16th century. I think the best known case, at least best known to me, is in Spain. There were a number of fakes of works by Hieronymus Bosch. It's quite curious. Why should one Netherlands master be faked so much in another country in the 16th century? Now, this is pure speculation, but think of the fact that Philip II, who in the little time he could spare from poring over government papers, was actually an enthusiastic art collector. He had two favorite painters. One was very much alive, Titian, with whom he corresponded about works. The other one was dead, Hieronymus Bosch. I just wonder whether that made Bosch fashionable, whether courtiers had to have one because the king had one. I mean, you see this courtier syndrome very clearly in early 17th century England, because Charles I was an enthusiastic collector of paintings who appears to have had quite a good eye. And then a number of the courtiers around him who hadn't previously thought of this start to amass collections of the same kind of painting, maybe to give Charles a good impression of their perceptiveness, whatever. Okay, so in the 17th century, though, there's quite a number of fakes are recorded. Fake Dürers, fake Giorgiones, fake paintings by Jacob Ruysdael, and maybe most notorious of all, fake Claudes. Fake work landscapes by Claude were so common they provoked the artist to produce what I believe is the first oeuvre catalogue, in this case of his own work. He entitled the catalogue the Liber Veritatis, the Book of Truth. And the biographies of artists that I mentioned, from time to time, they mention in a very deadpan way that a given artist produced works in the style of an earlier artist and, revealing detail, smoked the painting to make it look old. As far as I remember, they never go so far to say that this artist actually sold that painting as if it was an original of the other artist. But one really is rather led to make that conclusion. And some art dealers, which is a growing profession in the 17th century, sold copies as if they were originals. The Dutch artist and art dealer Gerrit Eulenburg was accused of doing this in 1675, a collection of paintings he was selling to the Elector of Brandenburg. No wonder then that the treatises discuss in detail how you might distinguish originals from copies. I should say that the jury was and is out on the question whether this dealer really sold copies as if they were originals. I should say jury in a literal sense, because the case went to court, and you have this interesting situation of there being artists called as expert witnesses. This is relatively new in the 17th century. But the funny thing is that some of them testify that these paintings were the originals, and other ones say that they are all copies. What does one make of that? Now, the evidence for interest in attribution in the 17th century is both rich and various. Some of it comes from inventories of the goods of members of the upper class. In 17th century Venice, I think they were pioneers in this respect. You find increasingly cautious phrases in the inventories. I quote, "An old portrait, a copy of Raphael." Quote, "An old painting in the style of Giorgione." Or quote, "An old painting on wood believed to be by Giovanni Bellini." I mean, this is just the way that auction rooms guard themselves against having transmitted inaccurate information. In Flanders, something similar. One famous example, the inventory of all the paintings owned by Rubens at the moment of his death, including a painting, I quote, "retouched by Titian," or again, a portrait judged to be by Raphael of Urbino, or, more complicated, a portrait of Charles V by Van Dyck, but after Titian. And incidentally, this inventory of 1640 offers the first case known to me of the use of the term old masters in any language, in this case French, ancien maître. They are distinguished in the inventory from the modern masters who painted in the 17th century itself and would, before very long, become old masters in their turn. So it's an important and difficult question: who made the attributions at this time? Artists very often were called in. They include Bernini, who sometimes wrote certificates of authenticity, and Vermeer, who was one of the expert witnesses in the Eulenburg case I just mentioned. Another example, Velázquez, who reported to his master Philip IV, to whom he was not only a court painter, but also the official keeper of the king's collection of paintings. And Velázquez reported on the quality, the attribution, and the provenance of paintings, thus revealing what a contemporary called his learning and great knowledge of art. It is also at this time, something I find quite fascinating, that the attribution of works of art is recorded as a pastime in some circles, indeed a kind of game. Kenneth Clark used to refer, as a kind of put down of connoisseurs, he would refer to the attribution game. I never found the use of the phrase in the 17th century, but definitely you have the thing. Take the example of Madrid. According to the dialogues by the court artist Vicente Carduccio, art lovers, which, as he writes, aficionados, the equivalent of amateur, discussed, I now quote, paintings, drawings, models, and statues with much knowledge of all the originals by Raphael, Correggio, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Palma, Bassano, and other famous masters that there are in this city. It was a pleasure to see this going on, with people enthusiastically and very knowledgeably engaging in discussion with the best artists and many other private wits, gentlemen and lords, who spent many a happy hour engaged in this pursuit. And in London, we have the record of a specific, rather dramatic case. The architect Inigo Jones accompanied King Charles on one occasion to see a number of paintings that had just arrived from Rome as a gift to the king. And Charles, for fun, had the labels removed, and then he wanted to test the skill of Jones in the art of attribution. So what happened? It's described by an eyewitness, the Italian diplomat who accompanied the paintings. I quote, in order to be able to study them better, Jones threw off his coat, put on his eyeglasses, took a candle, and together with the king, began to examine the paintings very closely, minutamente. I think one might not be wrong to assume a bit of theatricality here. Remember that Jones was very much involved with the theatre with court masks. So there's a kind of pantomime of connoisseurship which accompanies actually identifying the works. Jones claims that he got them all right. There's no other testimony about that. By this time, spectacles and magnifying glasses had, of course, already become apparatus associated with connoisseurs. And now in Florence, Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici, the last in the line of art lovers in his family, as far as I know, he once tested the scholar connoisseur estate manager Filippo Baldinucci by challenging him to attribute 200 drawings to the correct artists. Baldinucci is supposed to have passed this test with flying colours. In Paris, another collector, a German banker living in France called Everard Jabach, was an enthusiastic collector, especially of works by Dürer and Holbein, but he also enjoyed the reputation of a star in connoisseurship. He impressed the Dutch scientist Christian Huygens, who wrote to his brother once, I quote, "You would have had unparalleled pleasure to see Jabach determine the authenticity of these pieces with a magisterial complacency." I like that phrase, and one might use it of a number of other connoisseurs. Only to conclude that out of 300 drawings attributed to Raphael, there were but 2 originals. And Jabach was also involved in another famous case of disattribution. The painter Daniel Mittens reported to the collector, Lord Arundel, that Mr. Everard, as he calls him, had been to see, I quote, a work that was said to be a Leonardo, but was actually just a copy after Mabuza. But I think the emphasis on drawings in the cases of Jabach and Baldinucci is significant. Collecting drawings was a sign of the connoisseur. Paintings displayed on the walls of palaces were often status symbols, a way of impressing your guests. But the drawings were usually kept in portfolios. They had to be removed on special occasions to be viewed by the owner and his friends. And viewing drawings in groups of friends sometimes led to debates about attribution. Such debates being particularly well documented in the circle of Father Sebastiano Resta in 17th century Rome. His friend, the artist Carlo Maratta, who was himself a member of this circle, drew Resta's portrait in the very act of connoisseurship, examining a drawing. And Resta was honest enough to record changes of mind, something that not all connoisseurs are happy to do, writing on one occasion, "I thought it was a Rosso Fiorentino, but it's a Baccio Bandinelli." And as I noted earlier, there are signs of increasing concern with the ownership of originals rather than copies. Copiers in the 17th century had a higher status than they have now, but all the same, there are collectors who will go to great lengths to be sure that they have something that's really by somebody's hand. Evidence comes from the treatises on art, but also from private letters, like the correspondence between the English diplomat Dudley Carleton and Rubens. Carleton wanted to acquire paintings by Rubens. Rubens wanted to acquire classical statues owned by Carleton. And they negotiate. And Carleton makes a special point in a letter. These paintings have to be by Rubens' hand, not a product of his famously large studio. And again, when Queen Henrietta Maria sent Philip IV portraits of herself, her husband King Charles, by Van Dyck, a British diplomat wrote home with the embarrassing news that after their arrival, the paintings, I quote, were discovered to be no originals. So a big blow to the status of the British monarchy, which means then that the distinction between original and copy was sometimes taken very seriously. And the last point I want to make about as evidence for the claim, connoisseurs of this period were already aware of the need to pay attention to small details. Giovanni Morelli may have been the first to recommend looking at ears, but his 17th century predecessors had already suggested looking at hands, looking at hair, and looking at drapery for exactly the same reason. What's not in the center may betray the hand of the artist more than the part that he's worked on most carefully. Now, of course, connoisseurship is not an unchanging bundle of practices. Originally, as I suggest, it was a form of implicit knowledge, a connaissance based on the eye and close encounters with works of art. Over the centuries, though, it has become more sophisticated by incorporating various savoirs, notably the study of documents on one side and scientific methods on the other. Now, like many historians today, I'm not comfortable with the vision of history as a simple story of progress, each generation of connoisseurs surpassing its predecessors, as in Vasari's story of the 3 ages of art history from Giotto to Michelangelo. I don't believe eyes have become any sharper over the centuries, but the invention of photography was a major aid to comparative stylistic analysis, followed by so many other aids. The naked eye has been supplemented by X-rays, ultraviolet rays, thermoluminescence, the chemical analysis of paint, and most recently, controversially, I think, by resort to artificial intelligence. We can therefore speak of the multiplication of assistance to the eye from the spectacles and eyeglasses on, and what we can speak also of the increasing achievement of certain common aims, as long as we admit that other aims may have changed over the centuries. And now, in concluding, briefly, I'd like to return to the essential problem of the reliability of the connoisseurial eye. Its value has often been questioned. In 1990, the new director of the famous Rembrandt project, Ernst van der Wetering, attributed the many problems that the team had encountered since 1968 to what he called the illusion that experts were able to determine an attribution, I quote, in the glimpse of an eye. And of course, attributions made by stars such as Morelli and Berenson have often been challenged. And disagreement between experts has sometimes occurred in full public view. And there was a notorious case, 1871, of 2 Madonnas. Which was the real Holbein, the one in Dresden or the one in Darmstadt? The experts disagreed. Over here, the notorious Leonardo case, 1929, it actually went to court because there are 2 versions of Leonardo's portrait called the Belle Ferronnière, one in the Louvre and the other was in the possession of a couple called the Hans. They wanted to sell it, and they asked the advice of the dealer Joseph Duveen, who never bothered to look at their painting. He saw a photograph and said, rubbish, it's just a copy. And they sued him since it was known that he'd said that. Immediately the possible price for their painting went down by a sizable number of dollars. And then the connoisseurs disagreed to such a degree that the judge in the case went to the length of instructing the jury ignore all the advice of experts. On the positive side, though, there are so many successes. Attributions originally based simply on the eye have sometimes been confirmed later by the discovery of a document. Sometimes it's a signature that was invisible, hidden by the frame, or had been overpainted. So the stars owe their reputation generally to a good track record, thanks to eyes that are aided, as I said, by a good visual memory, wealth of experience, not least by constant practice. Berenson, for example, confessed that, as he put it, I must keep myself in constant training by the contact with works of art, being surrounded by them in my own house. I think the point about constant training is as valid for connoisseurs as, say, for tennis players. Again, the Englishman Philip Pouncey, an acknowledged expert on Italian drawings of the Renaissance, he said to a friend once, he felt again and again how his own sensitivity to distinct drawing styles could be blunted by an interruption of even 1 or 2 weeks vacation. Seems to be a bit like playing the piano or the violin. Remember what Jascha Heifetz once said, if I don't practice 1 day, I know it. 2 days, the critics know it. 3 days, the public knows it. And so, having admitted that even leading connoisseurs make serious mistakes, sometimes even claiming that a forgery produced a couple of years before is a genuine Vermeer from the 17th century, the moral, I think, is not that we should reject the testimony of the eye, but it is that no one is infallible, not even the Pope, by which I do not mean in this context Pope Francis, but the Anglo-Irish connoisseur John Pope Hennessy, nicknamed by his colleagues the Pope not only because of his name, but because of his authoritarian style as director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Thank you for your attention. Okay. Yes, okay. So I leave all this here. Now the chat show.
Yes. Just give. Well, Peter, thank you so much for that exploration of the origins of connoisseurship. And we've been asked if we will have something of a conversation. This is in part because we've known each other for a long time. It's in part because connoisseurship is something that I've been personally involved with too, practicing it, though not at a particularly high level. And partly because we will have questions from the audience, but Peter's hearing is not that wonderful. And so when we have questions from the audience, I will try to repeat them so Peter can be can hear properly. So when we have questions, I'm going to ask everyone if you will keep them brief so I can understand them and repeat them. So I'm wondering whether, in your estimation, Peter, there's been a crisis of connoisseurship in recent years. Has there been a change in the way in which people, both within the art world and outside of it, regard the status of connoisseurship?
Okay, so yes, I have been trying to follow the history of connoisseurship right into the 21st century. And something that is very noticeable is that not long after the year 2000, you find people in the art world talking about a crisis of connoisseurship. I think it was James Beck over here who wrote a book in which he argued this, and he said in 1998, the last real connoisseur died, Federico Zeri. There's nobody in that from that stature left, and much more recently, I think about 2018, an Italian journalist was interviewing a leading connoisseur because I think, unlike James Beck, that one could still find connoisseurs in the 21st century. And you have this former student of Longhi, that is Mina Gregori, and she's asked by the journalist, is there a crisis of connoisseurship? And she says, yes. Too many people have entered this field. They think they're experts. They haven't been trained properly. They don't have the eye. So there is, I could cite other cases, but I think I want to go to the fundamental point. Is this right or wrong? So for that, it's necessary to define a crisis, which I would, and say it's a period of turbulence, which is followed by a change in structure. So we seem to find the turbulence because there are these people talking about the crisis. Is there also a change in structure? Well, there are definitely new challenges. I think, for one thing, because art has been changing. Now, connoisseurship, as I said, has been overwhelmingly concerned with old masters. Only a few connoisseurs have decided to specialize on 19th or 20th century art. But now, according to well-known dealers, the big money is in contemporary art. So that's a challenge. But also, there's the question of art having changed. First, there's the problem of attributing abstract paintings. Then there's the problem of what do you do with objets trouvés, which have a signature on them, but otherwise were not made by the artist. What do you do these days with what is it? Not assemblies of things. There's a special word which is just
installations or
that's
assemblage.
That's it.
Yeah.
Because the artist hasn't made every piece that he or she has put together. So how can you have connoisseurship of that? But if the old masters are being gradually marginalized by the rise of installations and so on, what's got to happen? And then science is a threat as well as an asset. Because you have people suggesting that artificial intelligence would be the finally infallible way of attributing works. I don't believe that for a moment, because what the machine has been trained to do is to spot similarities in brushstrokes between the painting that the machine is asked to authenticate and the corpus of paintings by the same artist, but that corpus is the result of work by human connoisseurs. Take the human connoisseurs away, and then, at least at the moment, the artificial intelligent hasn't got anything to work with. So I think of it as quite possibly a crisis, but out of which it might be possible to emerge. But definitely a time of turbulence in which there are new challenges, and it may be new structures are emerging.
Right. I think we can look at the project at the Guggenheim Museum in recent years that was led by Jeffrey Weiss and Francesca Esme, looking at material from the Panzer collection that was acquired by the Guggenheim of conceptual art and minimalist art, and trying to figure out which among these works had been fabricated in an illegitimate way by Giuseppe Panza, following instructions that had been made by the artists. And so there is connoisseurship of, if not exactly, this is not exactly contemporary art, but art by very recent and in some cases still living artists. But I'm wondering also what your thoughts might be about the involvement of, or the overlap, or the imbrication between scholarship, whether it's academic scholarship and or museum scholarship, on the one hand, regarding connoisseurship, and the trade and the auction houses on the other. Does the fact that much connoisseurship serves a commercial purpose undermine the validity of the entire enterprise or not, in your opinion?
I don't think it invalidates the enterprise, but it certainly tarnishes the reputation of certain individual connoisseurs who are, for various reasons, under suspicion for having authenticated paintings when they didn't believe in these attributions, knowing that somebody of their reputation saying that this was a real Raphael or whatever would vastly increase the price. And in a few cases, we know that they were paid a percentage by the dealer.
Yeah.
So other connoisseurs regularly made an income by acting as experts when sales were going on.
Yeah.
That was true of Longhi, that was true of Zeri, so among the very, very best. But I don't think that it necessarily invalidates the practice, because some people have deliberately given the wrong attribution doesn't mean that you can't trust other scholarly experts.
Right. I'd like to raise something that might be a bit of a curveball, which is to do with the boundaries of connoisseurship. Yeah. And I think of connoisseurship as being not only to do with the discernment of quality, as you mentioned, of the question of attribution, as you mentioned, and the ability to distinguish between originals and copies. You made these are three fields that define connoisseurship. I think of connoisseurship also as being to do with discrimination that allows for the discerning of similarities among within a group of items, that allows for classification. And that classification can be, and often is, the category is the work of an individual. Now, it strikes me that one of the great connoisseurs in the 19th century was the dealer scholar John Smith, who published a many-volume work on principally Netherlandish artists, Old Master painters. And he was one of the first writers to produce a published work that looked not only at his own stock, but at the oeuvre of a number of artists, regardless of who owned them. At exactly the same time as he was publishing these in these volumes in the 1830s, the great Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz was publishing his volumes on fossil fish. And it strikes me that their procedures of discriminating and classifying, whether it's of old master paintings or fossil fish, they're remarkably similar. And it's because of the tendency of specialist scholars not to look beyond the boundaries of their own disciplines that such a comparison has basically escaped people. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about the boundaries of connoisseurship and whether one could think of connoisseurship as applying to items beyond artworks, and whether there may be some commonalities that you've discerned in the 17th and 18th centuries, just as I've discerned this in the 19th century.
I'm sure Morelli would have agreed with you because he compares the art of connoisseurship with the developments in anatomy and medicine and so on. And of course, the term connoisseur is used today in many situations outside the world of art. So connoisseurs of wine, don't they have a similar ability? They taste the wine and they know in a flash where it comes from and maybe the date. And of course, it's very easy to check on that. So they have to judge blind, but somebody else can read the label. So it's a similar situation, and it seems some people are extremely gifted in that respect. And one could go beyond and say decision making in all sorts of circumstances often seems to depend on a kind of sixth sense. It's been suggested that there's not a huge gap between what Zeri was doing when he went to the Getty and was asked to see the famous Getty Kouros, and within a minute he said, "I hope you haven't paid for it yet." And so thinking of very different cases, firefighters who have the sixth sense, this floor is going to collapse within a minute or two.
Right.
And they get the team out and it happened. And they can't tell you how they did it. They just knew.
Yeah.
So I think this claim that you just know things, it needs to be justified. But I think it works even if the people who have the gift can't give an explanation of how it works.
Yeah, that seems to be the key to understanding connoisseurship, that it can work without necessarily an ability to explain how it works. But memory, surely, as you said yourself in your talk, plays an enormous role in this.
Yes.
And keeping memory sharp. I'd like to ask for questions from the audience. Yes.
Yes, in France it was the case, and I don't know if it's the European Thank you. In France, it was the case, and I don't know if it continues to be the European Union, that a so-called expert or expert of an artist was a family member, a widow, a descendant, or so forth. And this brought about all kinds of difficulties in some cases where, and I wonder what legally now, whether you might know what it is now, whether people have said no, just to be a member of a family doesn't make you an expert, even though they have a certain standing. So I wish you would comment on that or talk about that, please.
Did you catch that, Peter?
Not quite.
Okay, so the question concerns the role of family members, relations of artists who have in the past had a special, been accorded the idea that they have a special knowledge of the works of the artists to whom they're related. And the questioner is wondering if this is still the case, or if you've come across instances of this, and is this something where that's been superseded or continues?
Yes, I don't know of cases since the Matisse family, but that might just be that I haven't read widely enough. And in this case, there would be the question of explaining what's going on. Could they have inherited a certain gift, or is it simply that they had exposure to so many works of that artist in the family that they would instantly know if a given painting looked right or didn't look right? I find it very plausible that families could have this gift for recognition, even if they had a certain interest in declaring that good fakes were genuine because of what they might do to the prices. So, but that's a separate point, really.
I think of the case of my friend Joachim Pizarro, who is a direct descendant of the artist Pizarro, and I think that in his case he grew up with numbers of works and absorbed their character very young, and is also a very fine scholar who, I think, independent of any relationship, would have developed that ability. But he is a Pizarro. Yes.
I have a question about the word itself. You said the origin of the study. Can you not hear me? The origin of what you're writing about starts with the word connoisseur. Is that, I mean, that didn't come out of nowhere. Is there other words that happened along the way? I'm thinking Epicurean, and that's, I would imagine, older. And how is that not the same word?
So is connoisseurship, the term connoisseurship, what defines exclusively what it is you're talking about? Or are there other terms that have been used to address this area of thinking and practice, such as Epicureanism?
Yes, and I think there are other terms, and they're related, but not necessarily identical. So when people talk about the eye, well, that is the art of the flash of recognition. But on the other hand, there is the art of long, what Berenson called long looking, as well as close looking, which is a different method, but can produce similar conclusions. The nearest synonym, I suppose, would be a phrase rather than a word: art of judgment, art of judging paintings, which was a favorite phrase before, especially from the late 19th century on. This rather cumbrous abstract term, connoisseurship, came into use, to the annoyance of some of the connoisseurs themselves from then till now. Partly to mock it, I think. Bernard and Mary Berenson called what they were doing connoissing.
I'd like to tell a brief story, an anecdote about connoisseurship, because connoisseurship, I think, breeds some wonderful mythologies. And this concerns a very fine scholar who is still living, so I won't identify him, but it is a him. And at this point, he became subsequently a museum curator, but he was also a very senior person prior to that in one of the major auction houses. And he was asked to go and see a possible Titian in an estancia in the Argentine Pampas. So he flies from London to Buenos Aires, no short flight, is driven out along the highway, then turns off the highway onto a small road, and then off that road onto a dirt road to the estancia, the estate house, and draws up in front of the front door. And the owner opens the door, and the painting is just visible, barely, but visible, through the door. The specialist from the auction house, who's come from London, doesn't get out of the car. He looks through the window and says, "Drive on." So that's the myth of the eye at an extreme point. But you also mentioned the long looking. I had the opportunity to work for over a period of 3 days examining two paintings with Ernst van der Wetering, then not yet head. Well, actually, maybe he was already head of the Rembrandt Research Project. We worked in a laboratory, the Hamilton Carr Institute outside Cambridge in England. And we spent all this time with these two works. And his way of looking was forensic with a capital F. It was extremely methodical. And he pored over these works with an agenda. And he fulfilled that agenda. And it wasn't the coup d'oeil, it wasn't the quick look, I know. It was 3 days hard work. And then he put together, in fact, we both together put together an assessment of these works, and we agreed on this, and that was then eventually what was published. But it was long looking. So I think we have to think when we're thinking about connoisseurship in any field, whether it's paintings, drawings, sculpture, decorative arts, that this is a question not simply of the myth of the instant knowledge through the eye, but of careful long looking that complements it. So those are two stories. One more question.
Do you yourself know the way Pouncy and Gear looked at a drawing? Because I was taught this by Peter Dreyer, who spent time with them. Do you know how they analyzed a drawing? If you like, I can very quickly tell you.
Please.
Okay.
Please do.
A drawing is put in front of them. They might instantly, of course, know who it's by, but that's not the way they look at it. The way that they taught was this. You look at the subject, you see two people next to each other, a man and a woman. Okay? Then you might see that their legs are entwined. Okay? Then you just make a description in your mind of everything that you're seeing, because you'll then see that one man, for instance, has an eagle at his foot. The woman has a certain attribute, whatever. Or with two men that are saints. One of them is naked with a little wreath, and then there's another saint similar. You had to describe exactly what you're seeing, because those were the clues that would then lead you to most likely what this drawing that you haven't yet even mentioned the country, the century, and then within the 25-year period of where it's from. We'll go to the two men standing, wrapped, one with sort of leaves around him. It turns out, from the way you describe it, he would describe it, one of them would be Paphnutius, who was like Saint Jerome. The other one, the man who found him in the desert, another figure like that, is Onofrius. And from figuring out, by just looking at it, figuring out who these people are, you would then figure out that there was most likely a church in some regional place that their principal saints were Paphnutius and Onofrius. And before you even came up with the name of who it was by, you knew where it was for. And then most likely, you would have then, through your own knowledge, known that it was by the Bolognese Dennis Calvert.
Right.
But that's the slow way that they took, even though for sure they knew within a second what it was.
Yeah, long looking again.
Yes.
And iconography is extremely important in this whole field. And when I was on the Old Master Vetting Committee at the European Art Fair in Maastricht for 27 years. And my responsibility there, particular responsibility, was iconography. And iconography was often a way of discovering by whom a work, to whom one could attribute a work. Yes. So, Peter, I just want to thank you very much for this enormously pleasurable evening.